Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Daily Debate. My name is Ahmed Nader, and tonight we will be focusing on the presidential activities of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, more specifically on Sunday, as President al-Sisi headed for Britain to be participating in the COP26, or the United Nations Climate Change Conference, as we will be discussing the efforts of Egypt to be fighting climate change and preserving the environment in the past 7 or 8 years under the tenure of President al-Sisi, and the intention of Egypt to be hosting the COP27 in November 2022 as a representative for Africa. And tonight I'm honored to be having with me in the studio Dr. Walaa Salah, the Professor of Sustainable Development. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Ahmed. The honor is mine. Thank you.
We will be starting straight away with a report about the visit of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and the participation of His Excellency in the COP26 in Britain. So stay tuned.
Heads of state and government gathered today for the climate conference in Glasgow to argue over plans to burn fewer fossil fuels, the only way to honor their pledges to protect the planet. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has already headed to the UK, leading a senior delegation to take part in the climate conference. He is set to convey the impact of climate change on the African continent and how Egypt is sticking to its climate pledges to reduce carbon emissions. World leaders meeting at a United Nations climate conference have failed to set policies that would keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, in continuing defiance of promises they made at a summit in Paris 6 years earlier. Ahead of the meeting, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in a tweet that the time had passed for diplomatic necessities, adding that if all governments, especially G20 governments, did not stand up and lead efforts against the climate crisis, the planet will head for the terrible human suffering. In recent years, amid increasingly violent weather extremes, climate change has been thrust into the political spotlight. But while the core science has been clear for half a century, burning fossil fuels releases gases that act like a greenhouse around the Earth, trapping heat and wrapping the climate. Politicians have sidelined the problem. Now, after 2.5 decades of yearly negotiations, tens of thousands of people are descending on the Scottish city of Glasgow to thrash out agreements on emissions at the 26th conference of the parties, or COP26. Today's meeting has been hailed as a last best chance to stop the planet from warming 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. UN climate summits are a forum for world leaders to agree on plans to burn fewer fossil fuels, beyond the technical negotiations like agreeing on rules about how countries should report cuts to pollution or finalizing previous agreements. Delegates will haggle over 2 core issues: emissions and money. The UK government is pushing leaders to promise to cut their carbon pollution sooner and faster. It has put coal, cars, cash and trees at the top of the agenda. Rich countries have failed to deliver on promise made at a previous climate summit to pay poorer ones $100 billion a year in climate finance by 2020, an amount that covers neither the costs of adapting to changes nor greening economies. Delegates from poor and vulnerable countries are also calling for rich polluters to pay for losses and damages from climate change-fueled weather extremes that have done little to cause. But scientists, activists and delegates from countries on the front line of climate change are skeptical of the idea that climate summits can fix the problem. They have criticized rich countries for not honoring their pledges. They have also dismissed promises to cut long-term emissions that are not backed up by policies today.
Welcome back. You're still watching the Daily Debate. Dr. Walaa, Salahuddin, as we did see in the past report, the participation of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in the COP26, or the United Nations Climate Change Conference. What is the importance of this summit and the participation of His Excellency in it?
Okay. First of all, Ahmed, let's see it as a two-way. First of all, it expresses the Egyptian commitment to reduce carbon emissions and to abide to international agreements. This is on one hand. And on the other hand, it sees more appreciation for the Egyptian presence in this international event, which is very, very important to collaborate, international cooperation, and to agree on many, many important topics, and in order to set some kind of a datum or a baseline upon which we are going to have it or to be reflected in our regional and national policies afterwards.
Yeah, speaking of the policies in general in Egypt and globally, the CO2 emissions, or the carbon dioxide emissions that were agreed upon in 2015 in the Paris deal, what is the importance of having this agreement, and what followed? Did those agreements fulfill or were fulfilled on the ground in the following years?
Okay. Regarding emissions, at the beginning it was easier to talk to investors about energy efficiency, reducing energy, because it was easy to spot it on their energy meter. So they would agree to participate in this. But for emissions, it's difficult. It's difficult to assess it because it requires some kind of sophisticated calculations and tools along the project life cycle. So in order to set targets for carbon emission and establish some kind of measurement and monitoring for this, and to implement this not only on a project scale but also on a strategic planning and policy scale, it was difficult and challenging. But I can see that we are going on the right track, because you can see in the last few years we have witnessed some kind or many development projects that are actually aiming at more renewable and clean energy production, power exchange agreements with neighboring countries like Libya, Sudan, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and also with Greece and Cyprus. So because, as you know, and maybe experts in renewable energy know, that the problem with renewable energy is not about the generation, but it's about the storage. If you cannot store it, and it's very, very expensive to do this, then you have to find some other means of exporting it and having a financial return. So this was, again, you can see that it's not only providing the infrastructure, but also thinking ahead, having a foresight on what challenges exist for this type of having renewable energy, and trying to set forth a wise strategy to overcome these challenges. Yes. Through regional agreements.
Mentioning the negative impacts of the climate change, how did the climate change affect Egypt and the African continent?
The climate change is a very stressing issue that actually has put itself on the international agenda in many countries, and also in between multilateral and bilateral agreements, because you see that it has consequential effects on many different environmental problems. So you can see it in, of course, the rising temperature, global temperature, sea level rise, flooding and flash flooding, and also disruption in biodiversity. And unfortunately, we in Africa are the main affected for this change. Because we have, according to the vulnerability mapping in studies, that we have the coastal regions, almost 20%, I think, of the delta areas is heavily affected by sea level rise, and also you have increasing water salinity, which affects our agricultural land and agricultural and food security. On the other hand, you can find other countries which are fighting storms, and lately, so we are suffering very much, and especially with our limited budget to combat such a climate change. So I can say that we are the most affected, unfortunately, and this requires further action.
In Egypt or Africa?
Both.
Both of them.
Yes. There is the vulnerability mapping study, and also there is one national initiative to create an interactive vulnerability mapping in order to raise awareness among investors and planners, so as not build and construct on these vulnerable areas which are more prone to climate change.
Do we need awareness or laws?
Of course, it's laws. But you know that some people break the laws, and yes, they construct. And unfortunately, we find these misfortunate accidents that happen, and we find that maybe this investor or whatever has built in a floodplain area. So, of course, it is vulnerable to floods, and we see it occasionally every year.
We have heard about the pledges coming from all over the world about fighting climate change and preserving the environment, from Africa to the other continents all over the world. But there is a very important point. Does this mean that the economic hardships that we have witnessed ever since the coronavirus pandemic would make it even harder to be committed to the fight of climate change or against the climate change?
We are in a very difficult position economically because, you know, after the coronavirus, there's high inflation rates that many countries are suffering from. And of course, in order to have some kind of infrastructure that would provide some kind of resilience for climate change on one hand, and on the other hand, some kind of adaptation to climate change, this requires funding. You need to have some kind of funding to be able to construct such projects. It's easier to demolish, but it's very, very hard to reconstruct again. It requires a lot of money. So yes, we have all these challenges that are economically rooted.
Does this mean that we can't fight climate change and make money at the same time, or sustain the economy?
We can, of course, with incited and wise political strategy, we can overcome this challenge. But we have to work all together, integration. The government, governmental and non-governmental institutions, research, investors, stakeholders, common people as well, raising their awareness. Because, you know, climate change is affecting us all, but also the problem of climate change is everyone's responsibility. It's also in our life pattern, our consumption for resources. So we have to work together.
It affects everyone.
Exactly.
So do we have this strategy here in Egypt? Do we have this integration between the government, the private sector and the citizens to be sustaining the environment, preserving the environment and fighting climate change at the same time?
All these initiatives, you can see it in summit and international summits, of course, and also on the national level. We have many initiatives to gather together governmental organizations, non-governmental academics, researchers, in order to work things out. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were attending an event organized by UN Habitat, Covenant of Mayors, and it had a wide collection of academics representing governmental and non-governmental institutions, and also Her Highness the Mayor of Damiata was actually there, Manal Awad, and she had a very, very interesting presentation speaking about the initiatives that Damiata is taking in order to combat climate change. You know, it is one of the most affected governorates in Egypt with climate change. So it was very interesting. And also there was Khalid Zahabi, the head of the HBRC, or the Housing and Building Research Institute. So it was a very excellent chance to get together and to start to exchange knowledge and best practices, to see how can we overcome challenges together, to establish connection, to work on projects later on, and so on. So,
can you tell us more about the model of Damiata to be fighting climate change? What happened there as a success story?
First of all, knowing that Damietta is actually one of the most vulnerable prone areas, Her Excellency has decided to have a backup plan having or moving new construction projects away from prone areas. So this is the prime decision. And also to start thinking about the coastal areas and how to set engineering solutions in order to prevent sea level rise there, because you know that each year I think it was about 20% land was lost because of sea level rise. In addition to other, of course, measures that you can find, you know, employing nature-based solution. It was one of the pilot projects also in Kafr Sheikh to have this or employ nature-based solutions along with engineering solutions, which is also a pilot project between the University of Kafr Sheikh and also the governorate there to set some kind of model or example for other coastal areas to adopt.
Does this mean that we need a specified map or a specified model for every governorate to be fighting climate change, or we need a strategy, a full strategy for Egypt and for Africa?
There are certain guidelines or laws that we have to adhere to, but also each country or each governorate, each area is trying to tailor its own solutions based on its circumstances there. You know, the soil is different, the climate, the topography is different. All this, you need to study them well in order to come up with your own solution for combating climate change. And this is why in international summits, that's what leaders do. They exchange best practices in such a manner.
It is widely seen or regarded that the West or the developed nations, they are responsible for the climate change. Does this mean that they should be responsible for the recovery of Africa, for example, for the other nations from all over the world to be fighting climate change, or they have to do their bit for themselves?
I'll tell you something, Ahmed. I wouldn't really like to wait for someone to do something. Yes, they are, of course, responsible because they have extensively exploited our natural resources in an unprecedented manner. And up till now, they are still racing for development, and this is why they exploit more and more natural resources. But I can see some initiatives from some countries to adhere to climate change problems and try to find solution and provide some kind of funding in more prone areas. You know, there's the carbon taxation where they have to, for instance, if they cause the problem in their country, they have to make it up in another country by investing in another project. So there are some kind of mechanisms. But the point is, we have to look at the present time and see this is the status, this is the situation. Of course, they have to provide funding somehow, not as a kind of penalty, but as a kind of that it's our problem. It is
to be balancing things.
Yes, it is. This problem is we have to figure out the solution, all of us, because
for the sake of humanity.
Exactly, for the sake of this whole world. If it fall, we all fall.
During the summit of the COP26, what is the agenda of Egypt, and how do you see the calls of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi during his participation in this summit?
Well, I can say that it is an excellent opportunity for to showcase experiences, our national experiences for generating clean and renewable energy. This is on one hand, and also to represent the African continent and to represent its goals, its challenges, and try to provide some kind of funding for or establish projects for securing more and better solutions in terms of electrifying the continent, because you know there are many disfortunate countries that are still suffering from lack of electricity, water, and so we need a lot. And on the other hand, we are suffering a lot from climate change. Drought is affecting all. We are all water scarce countries, more or less. So all these problems, we cannot actually solve it by ourselves. We need some kind of cooperation among ourselves, among each other, and also to be backed up by the international community as well.
There's an ongoing interest by President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in climate change in the past few years under his tenure, in the past 7 or 8 years. How would you explain this interest? Does this mean that it could be leading to more investments, green investments, or the green economy here in Egypt, or this has to do with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations? What are the Sustainable Development Goals and the definition of sustainable development nowadays in the world and for Egypt?
Sustainability was always built on 3 pillars: environmental, social, economic. And not one of them should overcome the other. All 3 should come in priority. And this is what His Excellency President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has been doing in order to provide projects that suits all 3 targets. In order to have some kind of progress economically, socially, and environmentally. And also you can see it in new city development. They are changing into more green infrastructure, trying to implement incited policies, taking into consideration the already lessons that we have taken from our existing urban context, and trying to put in mind the climate change problem and how these are reflected in the new urban planning policies, strategies and regulations, of course.
So the environment is a main pillar of the sustainable development, or the sustainability of the economy, even socially and economically, 3 pillars of the Egyptian society. So on the other hand, how do you see the efforts of the Egyptian government in the past few years in this field?
We, first of all, we have secured a stable electricity, and also we have international agreements for power exchange. We have also established some kind of mechanisms like feed-in tariffs in order to allow a person who have generated excess amount of electricity to sell it back to the grid. There are some kind of funding for projects that address energy generation, and of course the Daba, which a nuclear power station there, it's going to operate in 2026. So there are currently active guidelines or actions in order to move in many directions. One of them, of course, is electricity, electricity generation, are using clean and renewable energy. On the other hand, there is also the agenda of water security and our further discussion with Ethiopia to ensure our share of the water Nile. And this is very much related also to climate change, because the more climate change, the more temperature increase, the more evaporation rate is going to occur, and of course the less water we are going to receive. And this is going to affect not only our domestic water supply or water need, but also irrigation and food security. So you see, they are all interconnected, they are all linked together. And I can see that the strategic policy is putting them in chains and trying to work them all out together. This is an incited vision, not only focusing on one of them and neglecting others.
How can climate change affect food security?
As I mentioned before, it depends on the environmental problems that we're suffering from climate change. On one hand, you have drought, which is affecting specifically the African continent, and also this affects this leads to water scarcity, less share of irrigation, less crops, and of course insecurity in food supply. So it is a chain that lead one to another, and this is why, if you looked carefully at all international initiatives now for water, for biodiversity, for climate, you cannot look at each one of them in isolation from the other. They are all connected together.
Does this mean that if any part of the world or any continent globally was affected by the food security or insecurity for this regard, for the being affected by climate change, by the water insecurity, does this mean that it could be affecting Africa as well and Egypt in specific?
We're all one world. Yes, of course, there is the trade, the common trade for food commodities, and so yes, of course, all this affects us one way or another.
In terms of the COP 2016, the 26, I'm sorry, and the climate change conference, what are the expectations in terms of the pledges that would be made for climate change, to be having money pledges or the reduction of the carbon dioxide emissions? Do you think that we should be expecting something in this regard or not?
I think we are going to find some kind of established projects. It is in their interest to have this or to put this in their agenda as well. And it is a win-win scenario for electricity generation and exportation. It's going to benefit some countries. There is the established connection with Cyprus and Greece now, and this may extend also to other Mediterranean countries. This is on one point. And also, as I mentioned, it depends on setting guidelines that all countries have to adhere to. And this is the datum where other regional policies is going to refer to. So for instance, if they said that we are targeting a reduction in emissions of 45%, it's different than 50, it's different than 55, for instance. These, because they are very much related to the action plan that are going to implement such a target. And of course, each country just takes this datum back to itself and try to work out further national action plan in order to get to the target on time.
Why do we get the feeling that some countries are still reluctant to be doing their bit and joining the efforts of climate change?
Because it's the race for power. The more they have, the more exploitation they have of natural resources, the more industrialized they become, the more power they become. So it is the race of power. But it also reflects that maybe they lack responsibility. I don't think that they lack awareness, because we are already aware of the global climate change problem, but it's about responsibility, taking responsibility and having immediate action plans to combat this problem.
So how can the developing or the less developed countries be fighting climate change? On the other hand, to what is going on, as you mentioned, to the race for power, to the race of more money?
It's true, we don't have much resources, much money, but there is always one way or another to use our limited technologies or limited resources to solve our current problems. So for instance, if we are talking about water, so we have, on the other hand, other strategies for water recycling, grey water, in order to reduce the pressure on fresh water. Likewise, if I said energy, you have renewable energy and many means or many forms of generating renewable energy that are or can still be affordable by developing countries. We just need to exchange knowledge and best practices, talk together, establish communication between us to be on the road together.
Why do you think that Africa is always the worst affected by the global changes? One of them is the climate change.
Well, this misfortunate continent, unfortunately, is one of the richest and the poorest countries.
So we will be staying this way?
I hope not. I truly hope not. I think that maybe if we just started or put our feet on the beginning of the road, that we are going to find some kind of solution for our problems. Starting small, and then we will find a solution.
Yes, and we will be finding the next report, and it is about the efforts of Egypt in terms of climate change in the past 7 or 8 years under the tenure of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. We have more details in the upcoming report, so stay tuned.
European Commission for Climate Change has lauded Egypt's remarkable attention to the climate change issue. The climate body pointed out that Egypt plays a leading and great role in this field and proved that it is a real pioneer on the road to development and sustainability. As for Egypt's announcement about its readiness for hosting COP27 in 2022, the European body noted that coming summit will be held in Africa, adding that participants in the consultative meetings, the pre-COP held in Milan, talked about Egypt's suggestion to host the coming summit. Meanwhile, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry revealed that Egypt has been already chosen as the nominee to host the next session of the UN Climate Change Conference COP27 in 2022. This comes as a country is chosen each year to represent a different region of the world and host the COP meeting as the president of the conference. At a virtual meeting of the heads of state and government on climate change on the sidelines of the 76th session of the UN General Assembly, UNGA 76, earlier this month, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi called for the necessity to seriously deal with any unilateral measures that contribute to exacerbating the consequences of climate change. He added that Africa suffers from severe consequences of climate change, especially the consequences that relate to water security, drought, land desertification, and the threat to food security. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi also affirmed that Egypt is looking forward to hosting the 2022 climate conference COP27 on behalf of the African continent, saying that Egypt will work to make a significant turning point in climate in partnership with all parties for the benefit of the African continent and the world. The president also called upon the developed countries to shoulder their responsibilities for reducing CO2 emissions in implementation of their international commitments within the framework of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, especially following the recent large-scale forest fires in various regions around the globe.
Welcome back. You're still watching the Daily Debate. Dr. Walaa Salahuddin, the Professor of Sustainable Development. As we heard in the past report that according to the statements of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, we are intending and we want to be hosting the COP27 in 2022. What is the importance of hosting such a United Nations summit?
We were just talking, Ahmed, that Africa is the most vulnerable or the most affected country by climate change, continent by climate change. So this is an excellent opportunity to discuss this on real ground. Have them on board, let them see our challenges and how climate change is actually affecting us severely. And also it's some kind of a token of appreciation to the initiative that, or having an established initiative or a roadmap between developed and developing countries. So this is an excellent step on the way.
Does this mean that Egypt is on the right path to be fighting climate change, to be putting into consideration that Egypt and Cairo could be hosting such a summit by the United Nations?
Of course, Ahmed. It's definitely a token of appreciation of the role regionally, internationally to combat climate change. And of course, we have our showcases to speak on our behalf in this regard.
Yes, the Environment Minister also attended some of the meetings in Glasgow before the summit, and she stated that we had a lot of efforts in terms of the renewable energy here in Egypt, projects of renewable energy. How do you see the progress in this field in the past few years?
Renewable energy is very much tailored to the context where it is generated. So first of all, you have to understand the potential of each type of renewable energy, wind, solar, hydro. All these types require some kind of an incited policy in order to plan for the right type of renewable energy in the right place and provide the perfect infrastructure for it in order to yield the expected energy generation from it. If you don't do this, your project is going to fail because you're going to invest a lot of money and you're not going to have in return a reasonable return of investment. The share of renewable energy in Egypt has been escalating recognizably, and this is a very excellent step on the way, because as I mentioned, each type has its nature and it challenges some kind of problems that you have to overcome it in order to yield the benefit of it. So I can see that in each type of type of renewable energy, we are actually developing our knowledge for it and having more experiences and more pilot projects in order to advance in renewable energy generation.
To be focusing on solar energy and the solar energy parks that we have here in Egypt, what are the main challenges, in your opinion, to this idea?
Solar irradiation is already an abundant resource here in Egypt, so it is very logical then that we start to think of using it fruitfully for energy generation. There are various methods to use solar energy. So you have the solar furnaces, you have, of course, PV cells, photovoltaic cells. You can also find some kind of projects to transfer this type of solar power into heat and then to other types. There are active projects in each and every field of these in order to try and to experiment always how to best benefit of this natural resource. Because as I mentioned, the resource is there, but you can actually have some kind of advancement that would actually make you benefit from it 100%. 200%, 300%, it depends on the advancement of the technology you're using. So now we are establishing, or we are having more sensitive photovoltaic cells in order to have more power generation from just a little solar irradiation. And likewise for hydro and also for wind.
Mm. The solar energy that we are focusing right now on, we have the Bin Ben solar power plant here in Egypt, and it is the biggest upon inauguration in 2022. What does this mean for the electricity, the electrical grid here in Egypt, and the possibility of transferring this energy to the other countries as well?
It means more energy stability, electric energy stability. And you can see that in the past few years we haven't been suffering from blackouts like we have had a few years ago. So this is again an evidence of the efforts in the power sector. And also regarding the power exchange agreements, it is some kind of treating the renewable energy as an asset by itself in order to export it to other countries and have, of course, some kind of economic development in return in this regard.
We can see, speaking of the renewable energy projects, we have the solar power plants, but what about the wind, for example, the hydro projects? How do you see the progress of Egypt in those fields?
There are experiments and tests in each and every field for renewable energy, because you know that hydro, solar and wind are the most they have the most share of renewable energy generation in Egypt. So again, for wind power, you have, or you can see more projects now to generate electric energy out of the mechanical energy produced by wind turbines. And also for hydro, we have the dams, and we are actually producing electric energy out of it. The point is the integration between them, because you know, if you are establishing a project and you are going only to plan to depend on one source of renewable energy, this may not be that efficient. But the idea of integration is very excellent, and it's now coming to appear on the field. So you get to benefit from solar power when it is already at day, and then you get to benefit, or in summer seasons you get to benefit from wind power during winter and when there is less solar radiation. So this integration, which is going to prove very economic efficient.
We did see the steps made by the government of Egypt to be fighting climate change, to be preserving the environment, but we've mentioned also that we need awareness for the citizens, we need rules and laws by the government for the people. Do you think that on those two directions, the awareness of the people to know what to do, the citizens themselves to know what to do to be fighting climate change, the rules and the laws to be issued by the Senate or the Parliament of Egypt, do you think that on those two directions we are on the right track?
I think this is the point that we need to put more effort on. And also your role as a media should be headed in this direction. Because if we are speaking to a common person, yes, he understands that there is a problem of climate change, but he doesn't know how can he help mitigate this. In terms of less pollution, less waste, reducing his or her energy consumption per day from electric appliances, from dependency on cars, automobile cars, and so this is something that we need to work on in the future, presently and in the future.
But if it was me as a citizen that I'm doing this, I know about climate change and I'm abiding by the rules and reducing my footprint, what about the others? We need millions to be doing this at the same time to have the same effect.
It definitely should be collectively, and that's why I am highlighting that the media has to take active role in raising awareness against the problem of climate change and the responsibility of everyone to take immediate action to limit their emissions and also to limit their energy consumption, because energy consumption and emission are just two faces to one coin. If you consume less energy, you are producing less emissions.
What are the contentious issues that you think will be discussed during the summit of the COP26?
I think maybe it is going to be how to tackle this problem holistically, because as I mentioned before, more attention was shed on energy consumption, but now it is how to measure and how to monitor emissions. There are some kind of international guidelines, third-party verification and certification in order to monitor the carbon emission along a project life cycle or a plan or a policy. But this has to be shared and implemented on a wider scale. Because, as I mentioned before, it's not really a common practice. Also in Egypt here, there are very, very few researchers who actually can calculate or can use such tools to provide some kind of estimation of how emission is reduced from a project or a plan or a policy.
During the summit, do you anticipate more pledges, more promises by the wealthier nations to be reducing the carbon footprint, to be fighting climate change?
There's the target by 2030, it's very, very near. So I don't think that going or adopting our current measures is going to...
Do you think the previous pledges were fulfilled?
No, they were not. No.
So we don't need any new pledges, we need something on the ground to be dealing with.
Definitely.
Something
yes.
happening.
Definitely, yes.
How can this happen? What were the previous measurements that we needed to be fulfilling or being fulfilled before 2030 and were not?
They put targets and they start to postpone it. They postpone it all the way. So you cannot actually grasp when is going to achieve this target of emission reduction. And also the target is very ambitious. If you cannot achieve this target, then don't set it. Set actual targets in order to have some kind of on-ground vision to the current problem and see how we are going to combat it.
We have a current problem. One of the major economies in the world, China, they have a climate review, and it was a disappointment, to say the least, in the past few days. If China does this in this field, what does this say to the rest of the world, of the rest of the economies?
While the US, on the other hand,
yes.
you have US and you have China. neither of them want to have or to present some kind of compromise in this regard, because they are racing each other. So as long as US is there, China is there, and vice versa. They are not going to show any compromises or reduce their emissions facing each other. As I mentioned, it's not only about power. It's not only about energy, it's about power.
We also hear about the 1.5 degrees Celsius in the temperatures, the rise that is happening due to climate change. Why did this happen, and how can we stop it?
Okay, to make it simpler, our ecosystem is very, very sensitive. Our body is just stable at 37. If it is 37.5, this is a fever, and likewise, it's the ecosystem. So you have this stable temperature, which unfortunately, due to excessive pollutant release, of course, out of or as a result of fossil fuels, burning more and more and producing more and more emissions. So this led to a global warming. Global warming is like when you are trapping the heat inside the surface of the Earth. So you are causing more and more global temperature there. And it is expected that 1.5 degrees centigrade is going to, or an increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade is going to occur just by 2025, which is drastical, because just a slight increase in the global temperature have consequential effects on the natural ecosystem, on species, and you can see that some natural species have led to extinct because of this slight change in temperature. And of course, we are still exploring the consequential effect of this slight increase in temperature.
Yes, and hopefully it will be turning out just fine in the upcoming years. Dr. Walaa Salahuddin, the Professor of Sustainable Development, thank you very much for being with us tonight on the Daily Debate.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you so much.
Anytime.
Thank you.
And this brings us to the end of the Daily Debate for tonight. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.